Here is another example of a simple columnar epithelium with another type of surface specialization. These are cilia lining the uterine tube. The shape of the nucleus generally reflects that of an epithelial cell, so the shrewd histologist infers the shape of the cells from that of their nuclei. Look at these nuclei. They're rounded, and so are their cells. Some cells adjacent are elongate, indicative of columnar cells. They're called PEG cells. Another feature of ciliated epithelium you can clearly see in this image is the dark line immediately under the apex of many of the epithelial cells. This represents the basal bodies anchoring each cilium into the apex of the cell. They do look similar to the terminal web supporting microvilli, but microvilli are much smaller than cilia. These cilia help move the oocyte along the uterine tube towards the uterus. The PEG cells are secretory cells producing fluid, providing nutrients to the ovum as it passes along the passageway. Now let me try and remember my opening remark when I first showed you this image. I think I said something like, here is an example of a simple columnar epithelium with cilia lining the uterine tube. Do you really think this is simple columnar epithelium? It's certainly ciliated, but simple columnar? Looking at this image here, I'd have to say that the majority of epithelial cells are cuboidal, as they've got nice rounded nuclei. But perhaps up here, they have a leaning towards being columnar, as some of their nuclei appear to be elongated. So, my dilemma here is because this epithelium undergoes cyclic hypertrophy during the follicular or estrogenic phase and atrophy during the luteal or progestins phase of the ovarian cycle. And the ratio of these ciliated cells and PEG cells also changes during the hormonal cycle. Estrogens stimulates ciliogenesis, and progesterone stimulates an increase in the number of secretory cells. And the height of the cells increases until just before menstruation. So clearly, in its most active functional state, the epithelium of the uterine tube would best be defined as being simple columnar, as I said in my opening remark. Perhaps the image here is of the uterine tube collected when the epithelium was not at its peak functional state. I mentioned the term basement membrane a little while ago. This is a section of the lining of the male urethra as it passes through the penis. This epithelium is of a stratified type, which I'll describe later. But unlike in most epithelia, here the basement membrane underlying the epithelia is quite thick and stains bright pink. Another term you may have heard perhaps is basal lamina. Basement membrane versus basal lamina. What's the difference? Almost all epithelia are attached to the underlying connective tissues by a basal lamina. These sheets of extracellular proteins and fibrils are so thin that they can be seen only with an electron microscope. Under many epithelia, additional carbohydrate-rich material is associated to the lower face of the basal lamina. If the accumulation is sufficient to be seen under the light microscope, as you can see here, it's called a basement membrane. The basal lamina is synthesized by the epithelial cells, but the additional material you can see here is synthesized by the underlying connective tissue cells. Some epithelia do not have a basement membrane, but almost all have a basal lamina. So to recapitulate or review what I just said, basement membrane is an old classical histology term for a structure that an epithelium may show supporting it, whereas basal lamina is the newer name given to the universal companion of epithelia that was seen only when the electron microscope came into use. The basal lamina has a profound influence over the physiology of epithelial cells, but it's not clear that the rest of a basement membrane has any functional significance. You may hear it said that a basement membrane adheres the epithelium to the underlying connective tissue. True enough for the basal lamina, but think about that for a minute. Can a thicker layer of glue hold things together better than a thin layer? And yet here in the penile urethra and later on, you'll see a prominent basement membrane supporting the epithelial lining of the trachea, both places where the epithelium is subjected to shear forces. So the concept of the basement membrane being a supporting or strengthening component may make some sense.